According to a recent article on Bloomberg.com, U.S. consumers are seeing home buying conditions at their worst in an entire generation as mortgage rates soar. And this is largely due to the response from the Fed's aggressive monetary policy tightening. In this video, we're going to talk about the recent decline in the Housing Affordability Index and how this real estate market may resemble the 1970s recession and possibly repeat double-digit mortgage rates that we once saw in the 80s. History does have a tendency to echo itself, so let's dive in. Welcome back. Well, it's no surprise that the higher interest rates have definitely had a major impact and have sent real estate sales and home affordability into a major downward spiral. Now, rates recently have declined slightly from what we saw as a 20-year high of 7% this October. But the recent rate decline is still not enough to make homes affordable for most people with the current housing prices. And wait, before you go ahead and say that 7% historically is a great mortgage rate, because I am really sick and tired of hearing this from my fellow realtors and mortgage lenders. Mortgage rates just a year ago were literally half of where they are today, and we're averaging 3%. Now, this means that today's average of 6.5% means that a home buyer has to pay approximately $842 more per month today than a year ago on a $400,000 home. So like I said, with the current home prices and today's mortgage rates coupled with inflation on life's essentials, home sales have nearly halted nationwide as many Americans cannot afford to buy a home. Now, according to a recent study at the University of Michigan, it was determined that the index of buying conditions related to the interest rates we're paying today resembles that of the 1980s. We'll talk shortly about what happened in the 1980s to cause unaffordable housing, and you'll be able to form your opinion as to whether you think this could happen again. Double-digit mortgage rates is really what I'm referring to. Now, before you say, well, I could care less about what happened in the 1970s and 80s, please hear me out. Though I consider it great when we can move past prior economic hardships, sometimes by taking a look back, it helps us to understand that if something's happening today, has this happened before? How did it work out? And have we learned from it? With the internet nowadays, taking a look back in history is just a few clicks away. But for many of you, you're still saying, well, wait, now is different. And I can tell you guys, if we didn't jump onto the real estate runaway train like we have the last 2 years, just like people did in past decades, I might say you're right. Now, before we take a look back in the history books, let's talk about current housing affordability. This can be determined by the Housing Affordability Index, also known as HAI. A housing affordable index of 100 means that Americans can afford, with their current salary and mortgage rate, a median priced home. Now, this is based on other qualifying factors like debt to income ratio and money down. But historically, having a housing affordable index of 100 or greater are thought to be very good metrics. Now, let's take a look at the recent publication from the National Association of Realtors of America's Housing Affordable Index. We'll break this down regionally and then tell you how to find the HAI in your state. Now, before we dive in, I want to mention that unfortunately, real estate data lags behind, and typically we're looking back, so backward looking data. However, we do have enough data in recent months that this will provide a real good snapshot of what's going on in the housing market. And we know that the Housing Affordability Index has declined even further since this publication. Now, in this chart, you'll see that back in 2019, we were in pretty good shape. This is why many of my followers have commented that we need to see home prices revert back to 2019. Most Americans were making enough money to well afford the median priced home. And as we fast forward to October, this number has fallen drastically to 91.2%. And as I just mentioned, I'm certain that this number has probably eroded much more since October. Now, I must also disclose that these calculations may be much worse than published because this is based on a certain debt to income ratio and borrowers putting down 20% down payment on their home. See the problem here? This means on a $400,000 home, for this chart to be mostly accurate, you, the buyer, would have to put down $80,000 in cash plus closing costs and any fees that your lender may charge. So when we're analyzing information like this, it's important to look at the fine print because the devil's in the details. Now, we already know that housing is unaffordable, but let's take a look at the regional index because these figures have drastically dropped in just 1 month from September to October. The Northeast's fell to 95.5%, down 4.5% from the prior month. The Midwest fell 6.7% to 124.4%. The South fell 6% to 91%, and the West fell 4.2% to 63.4%, meaning that they are really struggling in the West region to afford a home. So let's take a look at my state, and then after watching this video, you may decide to Google search the Housing Affordable Index of your state. In Maryland, the first-time home buyers index fell to 79.6% in September from this year's high of 110.8% in February. Now, in February, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate averaged 3.89%. So as promised, I want to take a look back in time. From this chart in the New York Times, in 1971, housing affordability was very high. Over the next 10 years or so, interest rates and the economy pushed housing affordability to historical lows. Back then, like we see now, there were many factors that were affecting our economy, including rising interest rates and halting home sales, as affordability eroded to nearly 60% HAI back in 1982. The Housing Affordability Index was actually at 62%. Now again, the housing affordability of 62% meant that only 62% of American households made enough money with the interest rates to afford a median-priced home. Now, in this chart published by AEI.org, comparing the housing crash of 1981 to then 2009, mortgage rates had peaked in 1981 to a whopping 18.45%. Now, before you could say that that could never happen again, stay with me. In this chart, I want to point out that leading up to the housing crash of 2008, mortgage rates fell to all-time lows after the 1980s recession. Not too different from what we've experienced leading up to our housing market slowdown. Back then, like recently, the lowering of rates to all-time lows created a buying frenzy that started around 2003, ending very badly just 5 years later to what we now know as the massive housing crash of 2008. And by 2012, the bottom had completely fallen out of the real estate market. And this caused millions of American homeowners to be way underwater. And if they didn't lose their home to foreclosure or wasn't forced to sell their home at a major loss, it took more than 10 years for most that bought during the peak to see home values rise enough to get them above water. Now, what happened in the 1970s that caused the housing market pain of the 1980s? Let's take a look at this article on Investopedia.com. In the 1970s, the stock market was a mess. Economic growth is weak, which results in rising unemployment that eventually hits double digits. Easy money policies of the American Central Bank were meant to generate full employment in the 1970s. Unfortunately, they also resulted in high inflation. Under different leadership, the Federal Reserve System would later reverse its policies, raising interest rates to some 20%. And for interest-sensitive industries such as housing and automotive, rising interest rates can cause a calamity, with many people priced out of new homes and cars. So hear me out. Soaring inflation, just like we've experienced, causes the prices of goods and services to rise rapidly. And this erodes Americans' purchasing power, just like we're seeing right now. And yes, in the past, the way to lower inflation has been for Americans to suffer harder economic times, including job loss for some, less money in our wallets, and unfortunately, a recession. Now, why would we think that this time would be any different? The real question is, how long will this economic downturn last? And when will most Americans be in a better position to afford housing again? Now, personally, I believe that because of the internet, the booms to bust happen much quicker than they do historically. And a lot of this is just having this available information at our fingertips, and news travels much quicker than it did back then. So on this one, guys, I do believe that we need to take a look back in time and realize that a housing correction or a recession overall may be necessary in order to restore price stability for Americans, just like the Fed has mentioned, and to bring the housing affordability index back to 100 or greater. Now, my guess is that we'll experience somewhat of a reprieve in the housing industry, at least for a short period of time, as recent mortgage rates have declined, despite the fact that the Fed has continually raised rates. But I think that this is only because of the time of year. Historically, we do see mortgage interest rates drop over the holiday season, but I believe we're going to see higher mortgage rates going into 2023. And I think this will be something that will be sustained for at least the next 2 years. So now the big question is, what will happen to the housing market? Will we see sellers push down the prices so that we can continue home sales for most? Or will we see a stall until 2025? Anyway, guys, we're all in this together. And if you like this video, you can hit the thumbs up. It'll let me know that you did. And if you're new to our channel, we welcome you. And if you're not, welcome back. Either way, if you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button and smash that alert bell. It will let you know every time I upload content to keep you more informed. Have a great day and see you next time.
Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.